What is it about the night? When the sun goes down, it feels like a different world awakens. The familiar places you know during the day, the office, the hospital, the factory, they transform. The shadows get longer. The silence gets louder. For most of us, night is for sleeping, for recharging. But for a select few, it's when their workday begins. They are the guardians of the quiet hours, the keepers of the empty spaces. And sometimes, in that profound loneliness, they are not as alone as they think. The stories you are about to hear are not from a movie. They are inspired by real accounts from people who have stared into the darkness of their shift and seen something stare back. Our first story comes from a man named Leo, who took a job a few years ago as a night stalker at a massive, sprawling distribution warehouse on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that's a city block long, filled with towering shelves that disappear into the darkness above. Leo's job was simple: get a manifest, use a forklift to pull pallets, and restock the shelves for the day crew. For the first few weeks, it was perfect. The solitude was peaceful. It was just him, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the gentle whir of his forklift. He'd put on his headphones, listen to podcasts, and the hours would just melt away. The building had its own language, the groan of settling metal, the distant rattle of the ventilation system. He learned to ignore it. That is, until the third week. He was in aisle 14, a section for small, high-value electronics. It was the furthest aisle from the main office. Around 2 a.m., he killed the engine on his forklift to check a part number. And in the sudden, deafening silence, he heard it. A soft thump. It came from high up on the shelves, somewhere in the gloom above the lights. Leo froze. It could have been anything. A box settling. A rat. He shrugged it off and started his engine, the noise drowning out everything else. But he couldn't shake a new, prickling feeling on the back of his neck. The feeling of being watched. An hour later, he was working in the adjacent aisle, aisle 15. He had his music on this time, but he kept the volume low. As he was lifting a heavy box, he heard it again, even over the music. Thump, thump, two distinct sounds. Closer this time, and it sounded less like a box settling and more like footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps on the metal catwalk that ran between the tops of the shelves, 20 feet above his head. Leo stopped dead. He pulled off his headphones. The entire warehouse was supposed to be empty. It was just him and one security guard, a guy named Frank, who never left his booth at the main entrance. No one was ever allowed on those catwalks, especially at night. They were old and considered a safety hazard. Hello? Leo called out, his voice sounding small in the vast space. Silence. The only reply was the endless, low hum of the building. He felt foolish. It was just the building. He was just tired. He tried to get back to work, but his eyes kept darting up into the darkness above. He decided to take his break early. As he walked back towards the break room, he had to pass the end of aisle 14. He glanced down the long, cavernous lane, and his heart stopped. At the very end of the aisle, partially obscured by a stack of pallets, a figure was standing. It was tall and impossibly thin, silhouetted against the dim light from the far end of the warehouse. It wasn't moving, just standing there. Leo couldn't breathe. He was paralyzed. It wasn't Frank the security guard. This thing was too tall, its limbs too long and slender. It just stood there, perfectly still. Leo ducked back behind the shelving unit, his heart hammering against his ribs. He peeked again. It was gone. He sprinted. He didn't care how it looked. He ran all the way to the break room, fumbling with the door and slamming it shut behind him. He leaned against it, panting, trying to make sense of what he saw. A trick of the light? A shadow? He stayed in that break room for nearly an hour, his fear slowly turning into a shaky anger. He was letting his mind play tricks on him. He finished his shift without going back to that section of the warehouse, and when he clocked out, he casually asked Frank if anyone else had been inside. "Nope, son," Frank said, not even looking up from his newspaper. Just you and me, like always. The next night, Leo came to work determined to prove it was all in his head. He forced himself to start in aisle 14. For 2 hours, everything was normal. He started to relax. He was just tired, spooked. That's all it was. Then, he heard a sound that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't a thump this time. It was a soft, clear whisper that seemed to come from right behind him. It whispered a single word. Leo. He spun around so fast he almost fell. There was nothing there. Just the cold, concrete floor and the towering shelves. But he had heard it. He wasn't mistaken. It was as clear as if someone had been standing on his shoulder. That was it. He left the forklift right where it was, a pallet dangling in midair. He walked, fast at first, then breaking into a full run, straight out the emergency exit. He didn't even clock out. He just got in his car and drove. He called his manager the next day and quit, giving a vague excuse about a family emergency. He never went back. He never found out what was in that warehouse, but he says sometimes, when it's late and the house is quiet, he can still hear that whisper. The isolation of a massive, empty building is one thing, but some places carry an echo of the lives that passed through them. Hospitals, for example. Places of healing, but also of pain and loss. These kinds of experiences are why night shift horror stories are so compelling. They blur the line between the living and what might be left behind. Our next story is from a retired nurse who worked the night shift in a geriatric ward for over 30 years. Maria was a night porter at an old city hospital built in the early 1900s. Her job was to answer call lights, help patients with water or blankets, and generally keep an eye on things until the morning. Most nights were quiet, filled with the soft beeping of machines and the gentle snoring of her elderly patients. The east wing of the 4th floor was the oldest part of the hospital. The rooms were smaller, the air was always a little colder, and it had a certain feeling to it, a heaviness. Maria and the other nurses had a name for it, the waiting room. It's where patients who were in their final days were often moved for palliative care. One of the rooms, room 413, was almost always empty. Not for any official reason, but nurses avoided putting patients there if they could. It just felt wrong. The call light for 413 would sometimes go off, even when the room was unoccupied. Maintenance had checked it a dozen times and found nothing wrong with the wiring. They'd just reset it and tell the nurses it was a glitch. One Tuesday night, around 3 a.m., the deadest hour of the shift, the call light panel beeped. Maria looked up, room 413. She sighed. Another glitch. She walked over to the panel to reset it, but as she reached for the button, it beeped again. And again. Beep, beep, beep. A frantic, insistent rhythm, as if someone was desperately pressing the button over and over. Maria felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The room was empty. She had personally checked every room at the start of her shift. She walked down the long, dimly lit corridor, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum. The air grew colder the closer she got to 413. She stood before the door, the little light above it glowing steadily. The frantic beeping had stopped. There was only silence. She took a deep breath, telling herself she had to be professional, and pushed the door open. The room was dark and empty, just as she knew it would be. The bed was neatly made. The chair in the corner was vacant. But the air was freezing cold, and there was a faint, sweet smell, like lavender. She stepped inside and walked over to the bed, checking the call button clipped to the pillow. It was resting peacefully. She touched it. It was ice cold. As she turned to leave, she heard a sound from the corner of the room. Creak. She froze, her eyes darting to the old wooden rocking chair in the corner. It was moving. A slow, gentle rock, back and forth, as if someone had just gotten up from it. Maria didn't scream. She was too terrified. She backed out of the room slowly, her eyes locked on that rocking chair. She pulled the door shut, her hand trembling. As she stood in the hallway, catching her breath, she heard a soft, tired sigh from the other side of the door. Shaking, she went back to the nurse's station and sat down, wrapping her arms around herself. A few minutes later, an older nurse named Carol, who was close to retirement, came over with 2 cups of tea. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Carol said gently, handing her a cup. Maria told her what happened. The call light, the cold, the smell of lavender, the rocking chair. She expected Carol to laugh or to tell her she was imagining things. Instead, Carol just nodded slowly, a sad look on her face. "Ah," she said quietly. "You met Eleanor." Carol explained that decades ago, a woman named Eleanor had passed away in that room. She had been in the hospital for months. She had no family who visited. The nurses were all she had. She loved the smell of lavender and would ask them to put a little sachet on her bedside table. Her favorite thing to do was sit in that rocking chair and look out the window. She passed away peacefully in that very chair on a Tuesday night. Ever since, Carol said, she lets us know she's still here. She doesn't mean any harm. Sometimes the light goes off if a patient needs help in another room, like she's trying to warn us. Sometimes, I think she's just lonely. Maria worked at that hospital for another 15 years. She never went into room 413 alone again. But sometimes, on a quiet night, she'd stand in the hallway and catch the faint scent of lavender drifting from under the door. And she'd whisper, "Good night, Eleanor," before continuing on her rounds. Some jobs are defined by their isolation. It's part of the description. But what happens when that isolation is broken by something that shouldn't be there? Something that doesn't belong in the natural world? And what makes these true scary stories so chilling is how they happen in the most ordinary of places, to the most ordinary of people. Our final story takes us deep into the wilderness, to a job where your only companion is the radio, and your only view is miles and miles of trees. This account comes from a young man named Jake who took a summer job as a fire lookout in a remote national forest. It was his dream job: peace, quiet, and a breathtaking view. His post was a small cabin on top of a steel tower, miles from the nearest road. His only contact with the outside world was a radio to check in with the main ranger station every evening. For the first month, it was pure bliss. He watched thunderstorms roll in from 100 miles away. He saw herds of elk moving through the valleys below. The loneliness was a comfort. The silence of the forest was his friend. The trouble started in late July. It was a clear, moonless night. Jake was reading by the light of a lantern when he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A flicker of light, deep in the woods to the north. It wasn't the orange glow of a fire. It was a pale, white light, and it was moving. It would appear in one spot, hover for a few seconds, and then instantly vanish, only to reappear 100 yards to the left or right. It was unnatural. He watched it for nearly an hour, his scientific mind trying to rationalize it. Swamp gas? Headlights from a road that didn't exist? Nothing fit. He noted it in his logbook and tried to forget it. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, there were 2 lights, moving in a strange, synchronized dance deep within the trees. Jake grabbed his binoculars, but the light was too bright and hazy to make out any shape behind it. It just looked like a floating orb. He felt a deep, primal fear begin to stir. That part of the forest was a protected wilderness area. There were no hiking trails, no campgrounds, no reason for anyone to be there with powerful lights. He decided to mention it during his nightly check-in. "Ranger Station, this is Lookout 7, he said into the radio. The reply came back, crackling with static. "Go ahead, 7. All clear on your end?" "All clear, but I've been seeing some strange lights up in the northern valley for the past few nights." "Not a fire, just lights." There was a long pause on the other end, longer than usual. Finally, the voice came back, but it sounded different, tighter. "Copy that, 7. Probably just local kids with flashlights. Don't worry about it. Station out. But Jake knew that was a lie. The nearest town was 50 miles away. No kid was hiking that deep into the wilderness to play with flashlights. The ranger's dismissive tone didn't reassure him. It scared him more. It was the kind of tone someone uses when they know something they don't want to talk about. The next night, the fear truly set in. He was trying to sleep, but every creak of the tower made him jump. Around 1 a.m., his radio crackled to life. It wasn't the ranger station. It was just static. But underneath the static, he could hear something else. A voice. It was distorted and broken, but it was unmistakably a whisper. He couldn't make out the words. It sounded like a corrupted recording, playing on a loop. Then, the whispering was replaced by a clicking sound, a rapid series of clicks and pops. It sounded like a form of communication, but not one he recognized. Jake scrambled to turn the radio off, his hands shaking. He was now wide awake, his body buzzing with adrenaline. He peered out the window into the pitch-black night. The lights were back, but this time, they weren't in the distant valley. They were at the base of his tower. Two pale, white orbs, floating just at the edge of the tree line. They weren't moving, just watching. Jake backed away from the window, his breath catching in his throat. He felt like an insect under a microscope, exposed, hunted. He spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the small cabin, a fire axe clutched in his hands, listening. The clicking on the radio had stopped, but now he could hear a new sound. A faint, rhythmic scratching coming from outside, from the steel legs of the tower. Scurry, scurry, scurry. It sounded like something was trying to climb. That was the longest night of Jake's life. He didn't sleep. He just sat there, listening to the scraping, waiting for the sun to rise. The second the first rays of dawn hit the horizon, the scraping stopped. He dared to look out the window. The lights were gone. There was nothing there. He used the radio the moment his check-in window opened. He didn't try to sound calm. He yelled into it, telling them what happened, that something was trying to get into his tower. He demanded they send someone. This time, the ranger's voice was serious. "Stay inside, son. Lock the door. We're on our way." It took a helicopter 4 hours to reach him. When he was finally brought back to the ranger station, the lead ranger sat him down. He looked tired. "Look, kid," he said. "There are things out in those woods. Old things. We don't know what they are. The people who lived on this land long before we did, they had stories. They called them the mimixes. They said they could copy sounds, copy lights, to lure you in. We just tell our lookouts to ignore them. Most of the time, they keep their distance." Jake finished his summer contract working at the station. He refused to go back to the tower. He says the pay wasn't worth the feeling of being watched by something ancient and intelligent from the darkness of the woods. He doesn't look at a star-filled sky the same way anymore. He's always wondering what lights are stars, and what lights are looking back. The night shift is a world unto itself, a place of deep solitude that can either bring peace or prey on our deepest fears. For Leo, Maria, and Jake, it became a stage for encounters they can't explain, encounters that have stayed with them forever. It makes you wonder how many other stories are out there, hidden in the quiet hours, waiting to be told. If you have your own night shift horror stories, we'd be fascinated to read them in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If these stories sent a chill down your spine, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more tales from the dark. Stay safe, and maybe leave a light on tonight.